This question of whether we can be confident Christianity true is maybe one that quite a lot of people are asking. If you type "is Christianity" into Google, the first predicted search that you'll get is Christianity true? So maybe this is a question that lots of people are asking. It's at least the most common question that people are asking of Google when they type in "is Christianity," but it's maybe a question that people are answering in lots of different ways. Because I think lots of people would say that the answer to that question is obvious. Is Christianity true? The answer is obvious. And some people would say, obviously, yes. Some people would say, well, yeah, obviously Christianity is true. Some people would say that's not even a question. And lots of people would say the exact opposite. Obviously, Christianity is not true. And there's probably lots and lots of people somewhere in between those two extremes. Many people who would say, yeah, on balance, on assessment, I think it is, or people who would say, yeah, on balance, on assessment, I think it isn't. And maybe there's a kind of there's a gap even in between that of people who would just say, do you know, I'm not really sure. I don't really know. Probably within that broad spectrum is where almost everybody in this room would fit in one way or another tonight. Is Christianity true? But I think probably one of the most common objections, one of the most common reasons why people couldn't confidently say that Christianity is true is because some of the things that Christianity claims don't just seem to be big, like we were hearing earlier, but seem to be difficult to believe. Particularly difficult to believe if we're kind of University of Bath critical thinking intelligent students who would consider ourselves to be capable of rational thinking and 21st century academical facets. How could we really believe in a worldview, in a kind of Christianity that claims that miracles can happen, when miracles clearly violate the laws of science? Maybe many people would just say, look, I'm just too scientifically minded, I'm too much of a rational thinker to take Christianity seriously, to really believe that Christianity is true, because I know that Christianity claims that miracles are true. Let me at first just say, though, we do need to be aware that we're speaking about the same things, because sometimes when the word miracle has become kind of flagrantly used. Some people might say, "Oh, it's a miracle I got here on time." And well, if your timekeeping is how some people's timekeeping is, that might be kind of true, but that's not really a miracle in the strictest sense, is it? So, in case you're wondering, a definition of a miracle is an event which is not producible by the natural causes that are operative at the time and place the event occurs. So a miracle is something that is impossible under natural forces. And that makes it very difficult to believe in miracles, doesn't it, if we're rational scientific thinkers. So Marcus Roos, who's an atheistic philosopher, he said this: miracles lie outside of science, which by definition deals with the natural, the repeatable, that which is governed by law. Miracles lie outside of science, which is by nature dealing with that which is natural. But you know what? I agree with Marcus Roos. I think he's right. I think miracles lie outside of science. You see, because something lying outside of something else doesn't necessarily mean that they contradict one another, do they? It just means that they're in different realms. So whilst it might be a common objection, people saying, look, I'm just too scientifically minded to believe in miracles. I'm too everything I believe is got to come from within the realms of rational thinking and science. Whilst it might be hard to believe that there can be anything outside of that world, I think actually daily we do believe in something outside that world. For example, ethics, how we decide right from wrong, is a discipline that exists entirely outside of science. So, science doesn't say what is right and wrong, science just says what is and isn't. But no human being claims to say that they don't believe in right and wrong. They don't believe that there's any kind of ethical distinction between one action and another. But ethics lies outside of science, and so surely at least we can believe that there is something that is understandable outside of science, even if miracles does fall into that category. Let me make a really kind of contrite and silly example. If as I left Cardiff at 3:30 this afternoon, I left £100 in my bedside drawer next to my bed, and then when I get back to Cardiff later this evening, I open my bedside drawer and find that there is not £100 in the bedside drawer, there is £10. It would be crazy of me to suggest that the laws of mathematics have been violated, and that that 100 has become the number 10. No, the law of the land has been violated, and somebody has nicked 90 quid of mine, and for reasons inexplicable left a tenner behind. It's a slightly contrite example, but I hope you get my point. In order for us to say that we cannot believe that miracles could happen, and therefore we cannot believe in Christianity because we are rational scientific thinkers, is holding to actually quite a closed mindset, and ironically it's often Christians who are accused of being somewhat closed-minded. In a closed system, in a contained system, is how we understand things to happen. So a miracle is saying that something can happen when something external is happening within that system. Again, let me take a slightly silly example. It is a law of science that oxygen and potassium will combust when they're combined with one another. But every single person in this room contains both oxygen and potassium in their body. And as far as I'm aware, none of us are currently on fire. And the reason for that is very simple and very straightforward, that there are external factors influencing the presence of oxygen and potassium in your and my body that is stopping us from combusting. That is what me as a Christian, or any Christian, is claiming when we say that we believe that God could make miracles. That we are saying that there could be an external factor acting. That's what the Christian claim is that something, in fact somebody, someone, is interfering in the natural order of things. Well, this might seem, okay, well, what has this got anything to do with, can we be confident that Christianity is true? What does a kind of philosophical and scientific rationale, whether miracles can really happen, have anything to do with whether Christianity is feasible? What's that got to do with it? Well, there's an elephant in the room here. Because in fact, Christianity really doesn't come down to whether miracles can happen. It really rises or falls, it lives or dies on one miracle, and whether one miracle actually happened. And that miracle is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let me read to you just a brief account of the resurrection of Jesus Christ that Christians believe in, that's found in the 20th chapter of the account of Jesus' life, written by one of his closest friends called John. And he writes this: Mary, that's one of Jesus' female followers, stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, stooped to look into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at his head and one at his feet. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They have taken away my Lord. I do not know where they have laid him." Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Who do you seek?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him. I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and to your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord, and that he has said these things to her." Another place in the Bible, in a book called 1 Corinthians, it says that if that is not true, if that account of Jesus rising from the dead is not true, then Christians are to be pitied more than anybody else. Christianity really does rise or fall on whether that one miracle could really happen. But maybe for many of us that would just be too much of a stretch to really believe in. Can we believe that Christianity is true? No, because that just seems so unbelievable. David Hume, an 18th century skeptic, wrote that we have got thousands of years of uniform evidence saying that dead people do not return from the dead. No evidence could overcome that tremendous weight of thousands of years of evidence in the opposite direction. But is that really a contradiction? Is that really a contradiction? Is it really a contradiction to say that because generally people die, in this specific case something else could happen? You see, the opposite of Jesus rising from the dead is not everybody else not rising from the dead. The opposite of Jesus rising from the dead is Jesus not rising from the dead. And so, what we need to do is we need to look at the evidence for whether Jesus really did rise from the dead or not, and see whether we can explain it as he did or as he didn't. So what I want to do, just briefly, is talk about four simple historical facts. Four simple historical facts that are taken by both sceptical and Christian historical scholars to be historically verifiable facts. And what we're going to do is we're going to look briefly at these facts, and then we're going to say, what could explain these? What could make sense of these? The first is this, that Jesus died by crucifixion. Why should we believe that? Well, that Jesus was crucified is as historically sure as any historical event can be, said one historian, a guy called John Dominic Crossley. We've got loads of sources for that Jesus was crucified and died outside of the Bible. So historical documents like the records of Tacitus, of Josephus, of the the Greek and Babylonian Talmud say this. A doctor from the USA's Blood, Lung and Heart Institution was once asked, could Jesus have survived the Roman crucifixion that he was described as receiving? This guy named Alexander Methrel simply said, no way. There was no way Jesus didn't die by crucifixion. That's first little historical fact. Second little historical fact, that tomb that we just read about that Mary went to was empty. Why should we believe that? Because all sorts of people do. The most obvious reason why we should believe that the tomb was empty is because there were plenty of people who didn't want the tomb to be empty, but who never showed us that it wasn't. So when these followers of Jesus, weeks after he died, started going around saying that death was not as simple a thing as we thought it once was, and that Jesus rose from the dead and that changes everything, when that happened, the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities were not happy about it. So the most obvious thing for them to do, if those people were lying, would have been to go to the tomb, which was named and which they knew whose tomb Jesus was buried in, take out the rotting corpse from within it and say, look, these people are giving absolute nonsense. But they didn't. And why didn't they? Because the tomb was empty. So that's the second historical fact. Jesus died by crucifixion, the tomb was empty. Third little historical fact, the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead. Why should we believe that? Because of what they then did, because they believed it. Those first followers of Jesus Christ didn't just casually say that they thought Jesus had risen from the dead. They spent the rest of their lives telling people about it, and for most of them that meant that their lives were awfully short ones. Most of them went to their death saying that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. Andrew and Bartholomew were both crucified, just like Jesus was. Peter was crucified upside down because he didn't want to die the same way that Jesus had done. And even those who didn't die of a particularly early age went through a great deal. John, the guy whose account I just read, was boiled alive in oil and managed to survive the process. And he didn't stop saying that Jesus Christ had risen from the dead, even though that was the reason why people were treating him like that. The disciples were utterly convinced that Jesus has risen from the dead. And fourth little historical fact, that the first witnesses to the resurrection were reported as being women. That like we just read, that those first accounts of of the resurrection of Jesus Christ were reported as being, those first people who saw him alive were women. Any theory explaining whether Jesus Christ rose from the dead or not has got to make sense of those 4 historical facts at the very least. It has to make sense of the fact that Jesus Christ died, that his tomb was empty, that his disciples believed that he was alive, and that those first witnesses were women. But what I've just said isn't saying that the resurrection was a historical fact, is it? Let's be honest. Surely there are a few different ways of explaining that. Well, let me just take you through some of the most common objection theories to the idea that there was a resurrection, and you see for yourself whether they make sense of the historical evidence. One is called the swoon theory, which is the idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, that he kind of passed out from exhaustion and pain and trauma, but he just passed out. And that then when he was taken down from the cross and placed in that cold and dark tomb, the chance to rest and recover, he recovered his strength and was able to walk away. There's a few problems with that, Dave. Those Roman soldiers who were supposed to have killed Jesus were professionals at doing it. This wasn't their first time. And they themselves faced the death penalty if they failed to perform the task that they were given. One author puts it like this as well. The idea that Jesus never died on the cross asks us to believe that a man could survive a Roman flogging, a crucifixion from the world's most expert execution force, then a spear through his heart, then unwrap himself from yards of cloth, probably soaked in over 30 kilograms of spice, push away a huge stone, fight his way past a group of Roman soldiers guarding his tomb, and then appear to his disciples as the picture of health, convincing them that one day they could have a glorious resurrection body like his. Does that make sense to you? Does it really seem like the swoon theory makes sense of the evidence? Another theory that some people say is what really explains the idea of the resurrection is that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. But that doesn't make a great deal of sense of what the disciples then went to go on and do. If there are plenty of people historically who have died for a lie. There are very few people who have willingly died for what they knew to be a lie, and that they could have got out of just by backtracking a little bit. And if those disciples, if they really wanted to create a myth, to create a good story that lots of people would believe, then the story that they wrote, the story they recorded, wasn't very believable to those first people who they were telling about it. Those first disciples went on to write and tell everybody what we just read, that the first people who witnessed the resurrection were women. And in the first century, women's testimony in a court of law wasn't valid. So when the disciples were saying, look, Jesus is alive, and the first people who saw it were women, they were actually embarrassing themselves to their original hearers. They were actually making a case for their own point that was far weaker than had they made up that Jesus had first appeared resurrected to men. Why would they do that? Because they were utterly convinced it was true and that they didn't need to hide the facts of what had really gone on. Does it really make sense to you that those first disciples stole the body of Jesus? Maybe the third most common theory explaining away, or attempting to explain away, the resurrection of Jesus is the idea of it being all just a hallucination. That those disciples, in the midst of the trauma and anxiety of what they were going, of seeing their leader die so graphically in front of their very eyes, went into a kind of group hallucination and a group think, and the resurrected Jesus appeared to them. The problem with that is that group hallucinations don't exist. There has been no psychological verifiable evidence of group hallucinations ever happening. And so if we are to say that the resurrection of Jesus Christ didn't happen and couldn't happen, because that's the kind of miracle that surely violates the laws of science, we are just asking for another miracle that equally violates the laws of science if we're saying that those disciples experienced a group hallucination. Does that make sense to you? One thing I think the idea of this empty tomb, of this Jesus who really died on a cross, these first witnesses being utterly convinced that he had risen from the dead, and these women being the first people to see him resurrected from the dead. One thing I think it presents us with is that, can you imagine if you and I were those first people who'd seen the empty tomb and the resurrected Jesus, and as you and I walked away from the empty tomb, I said, I can't believe it. I can't believe that Jesus has come back from the dead. This changes everything. And then you said to me, I'm really glad that you feel that way, Dave. And it's great that Jesus has risen from the dead for you, but he hasn't risen from the dead for me. Do you see that? That would make absolutely no sense if we've both just witnessed the same thing. History is terribly brutal to that kind of relativism. Either Jesus was risen from the dead, and that changes everything, or he hasn't. And if that's the case, Christians are to be pitied more than anyone else. Karl Marx described religion as the opium of the masses because it gave people who lived a difficult life hope of an afterlife. Hope that they could kind of get something back for the difficult earthly life that they had lived. Some people would say, even further criticism than that because Christians only care about this resurrection, that Christians are only concerned with this afterlife, that they don't really care about this one today. But what if the exact opposite is true? Czeslaw Moritz, who's a Nobel Prize-winning poet from Poland, having seen the destruction and pain that atheistic regimes had caused to his native Poland, he wrote this: "Now we are witnessing a transformation. A true opium of the people is a belief in nothingness after death. The huge solace of thinking that our betrayals, our greed, our cowardice, our murders are not going to be judged. But all religions recognise that our deeds are in fact imperishable." The resurrection says that this world matters. The resurrection says that this world matters so much that God stepped into it as the man Jesus Christ. That he lived the perfect life that we were incapable of living. That he died the death that we were all deserving of dying. And that he rose from the dead to prove it to be the case and to say that this world, that you and I matter. That all is not meaningless. The resurrection means that greed and violence, abuse, they are not right and they cannot last because they belong to death and death does not belong. The resurrection said that every act of compassion, every work of art that celebrates what is good matters. That every fair and honest act of business matters. That every kind word matters because they all belong and they will all go on. Every glimmer of hope, every moment of joy, everything that stirs the soul is a sign of the things to come. The resurrection says that in our darkest moments, when it feels like all is lost, when it feels like the greatest life that has ever lived has been snuffed and brutally knocked out, hold on, because it's not over. There is a resurrection. It may be that you've got just too many questions to really believe that that's true. If that's the case, can I invite you, ask those questions. Text them in the next few minutes. We'd love to talk about them. Talk to your Christian friends about them. Ask those kind of questions. Because like it was said earlier, Christianity makes some huge claims. And we owe it to ourselves to at least investigate those claims. It may be that you just want to know more. That it would seem like this idea of a resurrection, it would seem like this idea of Christianity would make some degree of sense and would seem vaguely appealing, but you just want to know more before you commit in any way to it. If that's the case, on the tables in front of you are those things with uncover written on them. They are one of those accounts of Jesus' life written by those first disciples. That's free for you to take away. If you want to know more about what Christianity is all about, do take one of those away with you. And if you want somebody to read with it, if you've come with a mate who's in the CU and you want to read that with them, then do just say that to them, or do just get in touch with the CU and they can arrange for somebody to read it with you. But a few years ago, A few years ago, I was at an event when I was a student with a friend of mine, Camilla. An event not dissimilar to this one, where the guy who'd stood up to speak, kind of like I am now, had been talking all about this idea of the resurrection and whether it was true or not. And after the event, I got into the car with Camilla to drive home. And Camilla said, I said to Camilla, "What did you think of tonight?" And she went, "Didn't enjoy it that much." And I said, "Well, why so?" And she said, "Well, I get that Jesus rose from the dead. I think I've always believed that. I just don't see what it has to do with me." Maybe that's kind of how you feel after this evening or stuff you've heard this week. It seems like Christianity would make sense, but you don't get what it has to do with you. If that's the case, I just want to read what one person who found that to be the case read. This book is called The Case for Christ. Lee Strobel, who wrote it, was an investigative journalist, and he was horrified when his wife became a Christian. And he thought, oh no, this woman who I have loved all my life is now going to become really boring. But what he found was the opposite. He found that his wife became a better person after she became a Christian. And so he said, well, I've got to find out whether this is true or not. And so he investigated whether Christianity was true. And at the end, he wrote this: "I had reached the culmination of my nearly 2-year journey. It was finally time to deal with the most pressing question of all. Now what? After a personal investigation that had spanned more than 600 days and countless hours, my own verdict in the case for Christ was clear. However, as I sat at my desk, I realised that I needed more than an intellectual decision. I wanted to take an experiential step. Looking for a way to bring that about, I reached over to a Bible and opened John chapter 1 and verse 12, a verse I'd encountered during my investigation. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God." The key verbs in this verse spell out with mathematical precision what it takes to go beyond mere mental assent to Jesus' deity and to enter into an ongoing relationship with him by becoming adopted into God's family. Believe, receive, become. It may be that you've investigated enough, and what you want to do is to believe that Jesus really is who he claimed to be, that he really did die on the cross for all that we have done wrong, and he really did rise from the dead to offer us eternal life. And it may be that you don't just want to trust that is to be the case, but you want to receive what that gives. You want to receive the forgiveness for all that we have done wrong in the past and the hope that we have in the future that Jesus has guaranteed for us in his resurrection. If that's the case, then I'm going to say a short prayer now and just invite anybody who wants to pray it along with me. Not by doing anything crazy like standing up or putting a hand in the air or praying out loud. But if this is the kind of thing you want to commit to, if you have heard enough that you want to say, yeah, count me in to this Christianity thing, then feel free to pray along with me in the quiet of your own heart as I basically pray, sorry, thank you, please. Sorry for all that I've done wrong. Thank you for dying for me and raising from the dead to offer me new life. Please let my life now be all about you. But just before we go into a time of, we have a chance for some more drinks and some more questions, let me pray and then we'll go. Father, thank you for all that you have done for us. We are sorry that we have messed up so much, that we have lived selfishly and for ourselves oh so often, that we are so far short of perfect. Thank you for sending Jesus to die on a cross for us, to raise from the dead to offer us new life. Please, let my life now be all about him and no longer about me. Amen.